Good day, culinarians. Today we're going to go over Chapter 16. Chapter 16, Understanding Meat and Game. Um, Keep in mind, take notes, highlight, however you're going to do it. If you have any questions, like before, just email me or write down your questions when we get to class. Ask me the questions in class. I'll try to answer them best I can. Your tests on this chapter, your written tests, remember, save all your tests. Hopefully you've been saving all your tests. That's going to be your study guide for the final. Okay, so chapter 16, page 558, composition structure of meat components. Basically, it's made out of water, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. That's what your meat products are made out of. Water, 75% water. So whenever you have meat, 75% of that is water. Protein, you got your protein in there and the collagens in there. Your fat. Fat is the key thing with any kind of protein. Fat is good. Okay. Fat contributes to the juiciness of the meat, the tenderness of the meat. Once you get into fat, you get juiciness, tenderness, and flavor. So three key things that you want in fat. And when we get into grading of the meat, I'll explain a little bit more detail why that fat is so important. Carbohydrates is the last thing in there. Structure of the of meat products. You got your connective tissues that hold things together. Meats high in connective tissue are usually from the more muscular regions of the animal. Meats high in connective tissue can be more tender by using proper cooking techniques. You got collagen and elasticin in there. Collagen, long, slow cooking process. That's why some of those meats you want to cook low and slow to tenderize them. For instance, a brisket. Brisket, you're going to cook low and slow. Brisket, put it in a smoker, let it smoke for several hours, or put it in the oven, let it roast for several hours. Very low temperature. Cook it low and slow for a lot of these more tougher pieces of meat. Elasticin usually comes, you see that more prevalent in older animals. Older animals have a higher proportion of elastin than younger animals. That's why veal is so tender, and a lot of steers, especially older ones, are a little bit more tougher. Page 460, we get into inspection, grading, and yielding and aging of your meats. Top page 460, you have the inspection sticker. Inspection is guaranteed for human consumption. Wholesomeness guarantees the wholesomeness, okay? All meat has to be inspected before it's sold. That stamp that you see on top page 460, the 38 US inspection sticker, that has to be on all meat to be inspected for human consumption. Quality is the grading part of it. Grading represents the quality, so different types of grade that you have on there. We'll get into grading in a little bit, but you want to make sure you purchase something that has been graded properly. Yielding grading, keep in mind veal, younger steers, they're not graded, which has a little fat content in them. Aging of meat. When you slaughter a steer, it's basically green meat. You want to age it. Typically, meat is wet aged for 21 days. And when I mean wet aged, after it is processed, it's cryovac, and that's called wet aging when you put it in cryovac and let it sit for 21 days. So you're going to wet age it for 21 days, a minimal 21 days. On page 460, we get into different types of grades of meat. On page 460, you got your prime, your choice, your select, standard, commercial, utility. Mostly, if you're working in a restaurant, you're going to be purchasing choice or select meats. Some of the higher end steakhouses will have the prime grades of meat on there. If you look at the fat content, if feel like the marbling, we'll get into a little bit more in this chapter, the marbling on the prime cuts, you'll see more marbling, which is the fat that is within the muscle tissue of the steer. Page 461 at the top, they talk about the green meat. Green meat has not had enough time to soften, which hasn't had time to age yet. So it's basically green meat they're talking about there. 461, they talk about aged meat. Okay, enzyme actions continue for the muscle tissue to be so it's no longer green. So that's what aging is. When you're aging it, it's no longer green. Tenderizing, once that meat gets to at least 21 days, that meat's going to be very tender. You're going to tenderize it after 21 days. Wet aging, like I said, wet aging, most meats today are wet aged. Once the primal cuts, once the meat is cut up, it's cryovac, it's set for at least 21 days. That's wet aging. Dry aging is when it's left out in the open. Typically what you'll do is you'll take the meat that's been wet aged for 21 days, pull out that cryovac and let it set. Usually if you're going to dry age, you're going to do something with a bone in it. We've done dry aging here at the school, taking a short loin cut of meat, sticking it in our walk-in cooler, and let it set there for 30 days. That'll give a total aging of the meat, at least 50 days aging. And then what happens is the moisture from that beef evaporates. So once you get that piece of meat, say that piece of meat is 18 pounds, when you get done dry aging, that piece of meat might only weigh 16 pounds. That's because a lot of moisture has come out of that. It hasn't made the meat drier, because remember, the juiciness from the meat comes from the fat. So you alleviate all that moisture, you still have that fat in there, and it makes that meat very tender, okay? Very flavorful. Dry aging meat, if you're going to do a large quantity of dry aging beef, when I was out in Vegas, some of the bigger steakhouses out there had a dry aging room. That room is probably about the size of this kitchen here that we have, and they had all their short loins set up on racks in this huge room, and they had ultraviolet lights in the room. The ultraviolet lights will help keep the bacteria level down, because what happens when it dry aged, a lot of times you'll get some mold crusted on the meat. It's fine, there's nothing wrong with it. You scrape all that off, get down to the real meat, and then you cut it into steaks. But the ultraviolet lights in some of these dry aging rooms will help keep the bacteria level down. On page 462, down towards the bottom, we get into grass-fed livestock, kosher meats, and at the very bottom, we get into the basic cuts of meats. On page 462, the categories of wholesome retail markets: beef, lamb, veal, pork, different animals usually are cut up pretty much the same way. We're going to get into how to break down the steer in a little bit here. Meats based on two factors. Top page 463. Meats are based on two factors: the muscle and bone structure of the meat, and the use of appropriate cooking methods. Various parts of the animal. Various parts of the animal are going to cook totally different than other pieces. When you're breaking down the beef, this side of beef, page 463, you got your carcass, which is the whole steer. Then that's broken down to sides, quarters, fore saddles, hind saddles. When you come into the classroom next time, you look up on the back wall there. We have a poster up there where it's all broken down, the different sections of the steer. So if you take a look at that, we also have it in the book here, the different sections all broken down. You have your primal or whole cuts of meat, and then you got your fabricated cuts of meat, which basically is steak. So if you look at your meat, you got your short loin, you got your whole short loin, okay? And then on that short loin, you have your New York strip on one side, beef tenderloin on the other side. Basically, from a short loin cut of meat, you get 4 different cuts off of there. So on one side, you have the strip loin, on the other side, you have the tenderloin. But then when you start, if you leave it whole and start cutting it, When you start cutting it from the fat end, the bigger end, you'll have the Porterhouse Steak. Porterhouse Steak is usually the first 2 or 3 cuts off that short loin, because that tenderloin on there is very large. And as you go down that short loin, it becomes a T-bone. Okay, T-bone doesn't have anything to do with there's a bone in the middle shaped like a T. Okay, T-bone steak is basically a steak that has a New York strip on one side and a little bit of fillet on the other side. Once you get into T-bone steaks, Porterhouse, New York strips, fillets, that's where we get into the fabricated cuts of meat. Page 464, top of the page, they talk about portion control. Portion control, a lot of places went to purchasing their meat already cut into steaks or portion control. You pay a little bit more, but in the long run, if you look at weighing out between paying somebody to cut all this meat properly, and that's the key, if they cut the meat properly, as opposed to getting the steak cut in. So for example, if you have a restaurant and you have a 10-ounce New York strip on your menu, if you buy the whole New York strip, you might be paying, $7, $8 a pound for that whole strip, but you got a little bit of waste on there. That whole strip will have a little excess fat on there. We got to trim it down. That'll make the price go up a little bit. And then once you start cutting the steaks, you're going to have usually that first cut off the strip loin, you can't really use it, and the last cut you can't really use. And then you got those cuts in between. But if you have someone cutting your steaks that's not cutting them exactly at 10 ounces, say they cut them at 11 ounces or 12 ounces, just a little bit over, that's going to upset your food cost. Okay, your food cost is based on a 10-ounce steak. So if you have someone cutting their steaks at your restaurant and they're a little bit more, that means your food cost is going to go up. Okay, so you got to weigh out the pros and cons of buying pre-cut meat in. Towards the end of my career working in the restaurants, I ended up getting everything that was pre-cut. That $8 whole strip loin that you bought, I can buy 10-ounce steaks, maybe $11. Yes, I'm paying a little bit more, but I know exactly what I have. I know exactly that I got a 10-ounce steak. I know I'm not going to have any waste left over. So a lot of places are going to portion control on their pre-cut meats. On page 464, we get the breakdown of the primal cuts of the animal. I'm just going to have you guys responsible for the structure of the beef. As we go through this chapter, you're going to see different animals in here. The only one I want you responsible for is the beef. Okay, so if you look on page 464, it has the primal cuts of the beef. You got your chuck, your rib, your loins, your sirloins, your round, your flank, your short plate, your brisket, and your shank. Okay, make sure you know the structure of this steer, because it's going to be on the test. We're going to actually put a picture of a steer on the test, and you're going to have to name all the spots. So you're going to have to look at this picture and go, okay, there's the chuck, there's the rib, there's the short loin, there's the round, there's the flank, there's the plate, there's the brisket, and there's the shank. Okay. Also, you're going to have various cuts of meat coming off of this. If you look on page 465, there's a short loin I was talking about. Top of page 465, if you look at that short loin on the right-hand side, that little round piece of meat, that's the tenderloin. If you look on the left-hand side of that long piece of meat, that's the strip loin. Okay. Next couple pages talk about different breakdowns of different animals. Page 468, get into primal cuts and fabricated meats. Get your fork quarter, your chuck, your brisket. Brisket is very common around here. How many people have gone to a barbecue and have barbecue brisket? You got your boneless brisket used for corned beef, pastrami, ground beef, stew meat. You got your hindquarters, your four saddles. Going over to page 471, getting into bottom page 471, getting into fabricating meats. One of the terms you'll see is meat has silver skin. Okay, when you're in the kitchen, I show you guys how to clean and truss a pork tenderloin. One of the things you're going to take off from the pork tenderloin up top is what's called the silver skin. The silver skin is thin layer membrane, connective tissue on top of the meat. So you'll see that in the pork tenderloin that you're going to be breaking down. We're going to take that silver skin off. If you leave that silver skin off, if you leave that silver skin on, if you leave that silver skin on and you go to cook it, it's going to be like a rubber band, like chewing on a piece of elastic. Rubber band. It's going to be gnawing on it. You don't want to put that on your food. So you want to take that off. You want to take that silver skin off. Page 472 shows how to break, and 473 is showing you how to break down some meat products. 474, breaking down the lamb. Bottom page 474 is going to show you how to stuff pork loin. In the book here, it shows you how to do stuff with pork loin. We're going to be doing a pork tenderloin. So we're going to stuff it. Page 475 shows you how to truss the pork. If you look on LibGuides, I have a video on there from a chef showing you how to truss a pork loin. I'm also have a video on there on Moodle on how to truss a pork loin. I'm going to put on there for you. So we're going to truss the pork loin, then we're going to cook it off in the kitchen here when you guys come in the kitchen. Page 476 is a little picture there showing you how to take the silver skin off the tenderloin. Also get into barding, fabricating fat back, put it on a needle, stick it inside, strips of fat inside the meat. You got barding and larding. Barding, put the fat on top. Larding, put the fat in the middle of it. 477, get into rib and loin cuts, beef and lamb. Since they're eaten mostly medium rare, the doneness of this is good for broiling or grilling. Some of the larger pieces of meat, the legs, rounds, chuck shoulders, usually for braising, something cooking low and slow. Bottom page 478, talk about the boarding and larding earlier. Boarding, thin slice of fat, usually put on top of the meat when roasting. Larding is when you insert strips of fat, like picture there with the needle. You insert it into your product and pull the needle out and leave the fat inside of it. Both techniques are commonly used in the food service industry. More of the barding than the larding. I've seen more of the barding in my career than the larding, but they're both used to keep keep fat in the foods, keep the foods nice and juicy. 479, developing tenderness. Different ways of developing tenderness. Tenderness, when you develop tenderness, becomes flavorful. You get more flavor out of the product. Top of page 479, they talk about comparing balance of results. Example, browning of roasting the meat increases the heat shrinkage of the product. So remember, whenever you roast something, it's actually becomes small. If you take a prime rib, 15-pound prime rib, you slow roast it, you might end up with 14 or 13 pounds. So it's going to shrink. That moisture leaving it, it's going to shrink. Searing and sealing. Searing meats, high temperature creates flavor and color, browning surface. We're going to do that with the pork tenderloin. Once you truss it, we're going to sear it off to caramelize to get a good brown color on it. Sealing the juices, we're going to turn it over and finish it in the oven. Okay. Bottom page 479. Cooking frozen meats. Meats cooked in frozen state lose almost no moisture while defrosting. Cooking frozen meats sometimes compromise the cooking process, because if you have a frozen steak or a frozen burger and you put it on your grill or flat top to cook it, it's going to bring the temperature down on that flat top. You want that high heat, so whenever you cook with frozen product, it brings it down. So you got to be careful, pros and cons of cooking with frozen meat if you want to or not. Page 480, they talk about doneness of the meat. Meaning of the term doneness depends on whether you're cooking methods of dry heat or moist heat. Okay, dry heat, meat is done when the proteins reach a certain degree. For example, if you're cooking a steak on the grill, throw the steak on there, you're going to cook it to a medium rare. You're going to cook it to 125, 130, and that's your doneness of the product. Moist heat, the doneness is when it's completely done. For example, if you have a brisket and you're smoking a brisket, you're going to smoke it till it's done. Yeah, the temperature's going to get pretty high in there, but the doneness is when it's completely cooked all the way and it's nice and tender, okay? Bottom page 480, testing for doneness, a lot of color will change, internal temperatures, testing internal temperatures usually use a thermometer. A lot of people, when you're cooking a steak, a lot of people use the hand method. You know, you take your hand, you make a fist, and different parts of your hand is more tender, more firm than others. I don't like using that method. The best way to check to see if the steak is done is just physically touch it and get to know how it feels. You know, the hand method, if you look at everybody's hands, everybody has different hands, different muscular structure of the hands. My hands, I've been using my hands all my life. So I think I have very muscular hands and they're very tough hands. And if you hit any part of my hand to find the tenderness of there, you're not really going to find anything. It's all pretty much tight. If you check your meat, the meat's going to bounce back. Over time you get used to how it bounces back, you get used to the feel. So if you have the steak on there and you push it down and it bounces back, that means it's nice and rare. There's still a lot of stuff going on there. If you go to push it down and there's hardly any movement, that means it's pretty well done because you cooked everything out of it. So the best way to check the meat by touching it is literally just keep touching it, and then you get used to the feel of it, okay? Page 481, they talk about different temperatures of meat. Top page 481, they talk about beef, 130 degrees for rare, 140 for medium, and well done is 160. There's different charts out there. Whenever you go work in a restaurant, the chef is going to tell you what he expects of you on how meat should be cooked. Bottom page 481, they talk about the touching method, which I just went over. Small sizes steaks. Basically, if you just touch them, you get to feel them. Hopefully, we went over and we're going to be going over some grilling of buffalo steaks in class here. I'll get you guys to try that by just touching that piece of meat, and you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Page 482, top page 42, other factors determine the temperature of the cooking. Temperature of meat before roasting, bones, you know, if the steak or piece of meat has a bone in, it's going to change the cooking time and temperature of their shape and cut of the meat. Number 6 on top of page 42 is very important, okay? They talk about the shape, cut of a piece of meat per pound. If you have a 1 pound steak, a 1 pound steak is going to cook the same all the time. Because if you have a 1 pound steak and it's a 1 inch thick 1 pound steak, that's going to take a long time to cook. But if you have a 1 pound steak and it's only about ½ inch thick because it's a lot longer, it's thin and long as opposed to thick and short, that thin and long one is going to take less time to cook than a short and thick steak. So if it's short and thick, long and thin, it's going to cook at 2 different times if it's a 1 pound piece of meat. So keep that in mind. Don't go by, you know, weigh a certain amount of pounds. Go by if it's thick, thin, bulky, and so forth. Page 484, get into the specialty meats, the variety meats, liver, kidneys, sweetbreads, brains, tongue, tripe, oxtails. Those are the specialty meats. You get in Chef Corey's class, he'll show you how to cook some oxtail. He does a very good job in making oxtail soup. He'll show you how to do that. Livers, page 485, they talk about sweetbreads. Sweetbreads is the thymus gland from the steer thymus gland. They take that out. It kind of looks like a brain. What you do is you poach it. Once you poach it off, you peel the membrane off of it. Once you peel the membrane off, you cool it down, and you can slice it up. Usually what I did was once I peeled it off, cooled it down, sliced it up into little like steaks, dredged it in seasoned flour, sauteed it off with a little white wine sauce. Page 45, it talks about how to clean and break down that sweet bread by soaking and blanching it. Page 46, talk about setting up some of the sweetbreads there. 47, they talk about tripe. Tripe is the lining of the stomach, I believe it's the third stomach of the cow. Get into venison for page 480. They show you how to break down a rabbit. So those of you that hunt, you know how to break down a rabbit already. And that's it. That's it on chapter 16, meat cooking. Remember, we'll have a test on this. Remember, look at that beef chart. There will be a steer on that test, and you're going to have to know all those cuts. All right, any questions, shoot me an email or write them down and ask me in class. Thank you.